Okay, we are live and Facebook is loading up, so I'm just going to give it 30 seconds or so everyone can join in. We're talking to our friends here, so all right, hello to everyone that's joining. I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Zach, here for another episode of What's the Tea. We've got our third time guest and executive director. So Jennifer, thank you for coming on once again.
Thank you for having me once again.
So it is August 25th, so we're looking at schools opening back up around Illinois in the Chicagoland area. So that is kind of the main topic for today and what the implications are and kind of centering children in the discussion. So first of all, I want to open up with a question for Jennifer. So what concerns do you have about the framing about going back to school and the discussion around it?
So I'm going to start off first by letting everyone know, or at least reminding everyone, that I am a parent of a school-aged child. So this was a topic that was important and relevant to me for multiple reasons, because of the personal connection that I have to it, but also because of the work that we do and the fact that my focus in the work that we do on abuse and trauma has always been around children exposed to trauma, and about providing, prevention education to children in a school setting. So as I'm sitting here and have obviously been paying a lot of attention to the discussions about when and how to return to school and what that's going to look like, I've gone back and forth with each of my hats, my parent hat sometimes and my professional hat some other times. And some of the things that have come up for me in part of it is that sometimes it does sometimes seem like we're losing the children in the discussion. It's not as centered around the children as I would like for it to be, because it's difficult. There's so many people that need to be considered in the discussion when you're talking about communities and school districts and teachers and other personnel around. It's very difficult, I think, sometimes to always have the children at the heart of it. And in no way does that statement mean that people aren't caring about kids. I know that they are. And this episode here today isn't an episode where we are looking to judge anyone's decisions one way or the other, because we know without a shadow of a doubt that everyone's doing the best thing that they can do right now. But the pieces that I'm thinking about from a professional standpoint is that we work with kids who've experienced trauma. We work with kids who do not always experience home as a safe place. And so one of the first things that struck me, and that I and our coworkers have continued to be concerned about, is this fact that the school for some kids is the only time that they ever feel safe during the day. So that's one piece that is a primary concern of mine, is that with so many schools not being able to return in person, we're continuing this piece where so many kids don't have a place that's actually safe for them at any time. And what does that mean, for those kids that don't have that safe space? And the other piece around it, again, is this discussion around the social emotional needs of children. And with them not being able to be together or be physically with their teachers, what does that mean for them?
Yeah, and I think we've got, as you were saying, a little bit of an outsider's perspective. So because of the work that we do, we deal with domestic violence and everything, all the intersections that surrounds it, which is, there are so many of them. So could we go into a little bit on what unique challenges there might be? I know we mentioned that some students may have only the school as their safe spot. So what unique challenges or what unique circumstances are we concerned with?
So I think some of the things that I am worried about is there's been quite a bit of reporting on the fact that DCFS calls have decreased dramatically since the stay-at-home order. And the consensus pretty much is that children aren't being abused less. The consensus is pretty much the rates are probably the same and potentially even more. What has changed significantly is that children aren't being seen by adults that could intervene. And so, what we know about violence prevention and intervention in general is that adults are a huge protective factor for children. And that's one of the awesome things about a school setting. There's adults all over the place in a school that care about those kids and are invested in those kids. And when they see something happening with a child, they look into it and they're going to ask questions and they're going to take steps to try to ensure safety for those children. And when they're not seeing them, they can't do that. And additionally, even seeing them through, a Zoom platform such as this, they're not seeing everything. And so that's a unique challenge to this right now, is that particular piece of it, and that lack of physical observation that is the reality that we're in. So kids are still being hurt. Some are potentially being hurt more, or they're starting to be hurt because now the risk factors in their families have increased. And so what that means is, there's this formula for violence prevention, which is essentially you want to increase protective factors for people and you want to decrease the risk factors. And this pandemic and the ways in which that we have had to respond to this pandemic, for a lot of families, have actually, they've decreased risk factors for exposure to the virus for sure, but they've increased risk factors for exposure to violence because they're isolated, they're cut off from their connections, they may have lost income, so their social economic status has decreased, which increases stress within the family. And so again, that's something else that's unique. What we've needed to do on one end to achieve one kind of safety may have inadvertently triggered a lack of safety in another way.
Yeah, so that's a great way of framing the conversation on how these two, the COVID exposure and the trauma exposure, are really sort of at odds with each other. So I do want to reiterate that I'm not coming from a judgmental place with the schools,
Right.
because I work in the prevention program. I study school counseling, so it's definitely on my mind. But I know people who work there, and it's not easy. So can you
No,
speak?
I agree about that. It's heart-wrenching all over the place. And again, that's why I come at this with the belief that we all need to just give each other grace and, really try to believe that everyone is doing the absolute best that they can in extremely difficult and unthinkable circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you were getting at something very important when you were talking about the protective factors and the adults within the school building. So can you speak a little bit more about what does school provide for kids that have been dealing with trauma? What sort of advantages does the school system give them?
Yeah, so it gives them a lot of advantages. I actually love school for kids that have been traumatized or even are on, a vulnerability scale of some sort. So I talk often that my son has ADHD, and one thing that I've learned about ADHD is that its presentations mirror trauma. So trauma and ADHD sometimes are hard to pick apart from each other. But one thing that school provides in having safe adults present is this possibility for one of the number one protective factors. The number one protective factor for a child is to have a positive nurturing relationship with an adult. Unfortunately, sometimes that isn't an adult that's in their family. So going to school provides an opportunity for a child to build a nurturing relationship with someone in that school. So oftentimes you will hear people talk about those that had the biggest influence, and they might talk about a teacher, or they might talk about someone who was a coach through a school sponsored activity that they were in. So that is a number one thing that schools provide. Another piece that schools provide just naturally, by the way that they're organized, is this idea of predictability and this idea of consistency. Schools are very structured, and structure helps folks who've been traumatized or folks that are vulnerable, because you can predict what's going to happen. So if you're living in a home with violence, one of the hallmarks of that is you never know when the violence is going to happen. You could be sitting there watching your favorite TV show and a violent episode happens and you have to react, or your body is sent into whatever your trauma reaction is. Schools generally are very predictable. You know what time you get off the bus, you know what time the bell is going to ring, you know the order in which things are going to happen, because it's the same every single day. So it provides children that level of consistency and predictability that feels very safe to them. They might not be able to say that, but that's what it does for them, is it provides safety because they always know what's going to happen. So those two things are things that just naturally exist in the school environment that are incredibly supportive to children.
So in the absence of having this, if someone is a student from home and you have a child that you're trying to help at home, what are potentially some ways where we can give them structure, despite being in a unique situation?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we can try to do, and I know that the schools, being a parent, I know that schools are trying to replicate that idea of a schedule. And that has been something that has been really hard for all of us who have had to change from going into our office on a day to day basis and ending up working from home. All of us adults, vulnerable or not vulnerable, have felt the impact of that change in structure and that lack of structure, and how it has impacted our own lives. And that is one thing that we can try to do for children, if it's possible for us to do, is create that structure again, if we haven't already been able to do that in our homes, to create that school starts at this time, and we kind of know what to expect throughout the day. And I say that, and also want to acknowledge how incredibly challenging that is, and incredibly challenging it's going to be. My son's remote learning starts next week, and I honestly don't know what it's going to be like. And I'm concerned about what is our structure going, what is it going to be? I know that we both need it to be able to be successful, but here it is Tuesday. He starts school on Monday, and I don't know yet what that's going to be. So I do want to acknowledge that it's not going to be an easy thing to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think you are not alone in that. Just in the schools in my area, I know that there were some recent changes as recent as like last week as to what the plan's going to be. So I
Yeah.
do think that, um, as you're saying, it's going to be figured out as you go a little bit, and also kind of come up with creative solutions. So have you have you heard of any sort of creative things that people are doing in?
So I know a lot of people are trying to be really creative about how they make learning spaces for their kids. So there's definitely some tutorials out there and some blogs out there about how to take the idea of a science fair poster board, right, and try to create a space for your child that kind of blocks out some of the distractions, because that's one of the things there. A lot of children are learning at the kitchen table, which is fine, but it can be, depending on your child, it can be pretty distracting. So people are trying to be as intentional as possible about creating a learning space, so that the child knows, when I go into this space, it's learning time. And then when they leave that space, it's back to, regular kid time. So that's if you do one thing at all, that's maybe a transition that you can have, is here's where you're going to be learning, and that's what's going to happen here. And when you're away from that space is when you change into not learning.
Yeah, it reminds me of making the adjustment as an adult working from home and having, an adult mind and adult skill sets, and it's still being a little bit of a difficult transition for a lot of people. So if someone works from home, you can kind of implement those skills such as creating that workspace so that's where you're working and it's a stability for that person. So any other protective factors, coping skills that we can really help someone in this time before we go ahead and move on to the questions? Any closing thoughts on this?
So there's another sort of big piece that we haven't touched on yet that I think is really important for us to keep in mind with kids. That again, I've heard some people talk about, but not a ton, is sort of this developmental aspect of what we're expecting kids to be able to accomplish right now. That's one string. And then the other string is the fact that the experience of this pandemic is traumatic to children. So we can no longer assume that all of the kids that we're working with have maybe not been exposed to a trauma, because here we all are in this massive collective global trauma. And for kids, what we don't always realize as adults is that the loss of their environment from schooling stopped one day and they never went back. That was a traumatic incident for children because they lost contact with a set of caregivers to them. And again, some of them lost contact with who may have been their primary supportive adult in their life. It stopped one day. They thought they were going to go back. They never went back. The younger they are, the more confusing that is. And in conjunction with that, they're probably hearing, that you could get sick, and sometimes when people get sick they die, and we can't tell for sure when and if that's going to happen. So all of these things have put our kids at a more vulnerable state than they were when they started the school year last year. So it's this concept of resiliency and what that is going to be like for kids. Are they going to be able, can we expect them to start the school year with the same ability to learn and retain information as we expected last year?
Yeah, and I think that's worth repeating even a second time. Just the pandemic itself, and as we're processing it, it's easy to forget how a kid hears mixed information. They pick up on how adults are figuring it out as it moves on as well. So, and I do want to encourage everyone to ask questions if you haven't already, because we'll be switching over in just a minute. And Celeste, how are we looking so far?
Yes, we have one question. Were you ready for it?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have a question. It states, how can we be watchful during this time since children who experience trauma as a family member or neighbor?
So that's a really great question. And it's a huge challenge right now, depending on how isolated a family is or how isolated you are from your community. The typical ways that we would see each other have been restricted. And that again is that's that risk factor there. So one of the things, the huge risk factor is disorganization in a community, and lack of community connections. Those are risk factors for violence. So I would suggest any ways in which you can make sure that you're retaining connection with people is a way that you can be watchful. So any way that you can, I don't know if you can do, if you have phone numbers and if you can do text and kind of stay in touch with people that way. I know that there are some people that are maintaining relationships by, putting notes on people's doors. I know that for one of my neighbors, I have a garden and my neighbor wasn't able to do a garden. So I've been picking some of my vegetables and herbs and I'll put it in a bucket and I take it over to their house and leave it on the stoop. And then so she baked cookies and brought it over to our house and left it on our stoop. So there's been a way that we've tried to stay connected, because what people need to know is who they have options to go to when they need help. That help seeking piece still needs to be there. People still need to know who they can go to, and it's one of those things. We saw that drop off dramatically here at South Suburban Family Shelter. We saw the help seeking, the calls for new counseling clients just completely plummet, and that was in DA agencies across the state. My colleagues and I talked about that often, how it was so weird because our phones were silent and people weren't coming in for counseling. And I think that's because they were dealing with what was now their primary trauma, which was this virus. And how do I do this? And if I'm in close quarters with the person who's hurting me, how do I control that? Now we've gotten to a place where some of that has lessened. And so people are feeling more comfortable reaching out for help now. So they need to know that you're still someone that they can reach out to get help from, if that's something that they choose to do. And feel free to jump in, Zach. You can add on to the answers.
I mean, that was a great way of putting it. Always keep that line open. We're open for calls at South Suburban Family Shelter, even though, because we do know, as you said earlier, DV and DCFS reports may appear to go down in reportings, but we definitely know it's still out there. So, Celeste, do we have any other questions?
We do actually. We have another question. Really good question, I think. So it says, since mandated reporters aren't with kids as often. I don't know if you all have the answer to that. I can also rephrase it and say, what can we do to help?
Celeste, I think you cut out a bit. I'm not sure, Jennifer, if you heard the question or not.
I didn't hear the whole piece, no.
Okay.
Oh, did I? I'm sorry. I'll go ahead. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, if you could just start from the beginning, please.
Sure. Okay, so the question says, since mandated reporters aren't with kids as often now, are there additional ways that they will be reporting?
Okay, I'm going to restate the question to make sure I heard it. Because mandated reporters aren't often in front of children now, are there different ways that they could be reporting? Is that the question?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm having some trouble with my audio.
That's okay. We'll work through it and figure it out. So the way that mandated reporting works is that there are certain types of people and positions that are deemed mandated reporters, and you have to report something when you have a reasonable reasonable basis to believe that the certain type of harm has happened. So they have to, and that usually happens because they've observed something. So maybe you observe a bruise on a child that looks different from what a typical child bruise might be. Like anyone who has kids or has been around kids know that kids fall and hurt themselves a lot. So there are sort of, my kid had banged up knees for 3 years of his toddlerhood. So if you observe a mark on a child, it could be a direct report that a child says. So they have to have some reasonable suspicion in order to make the report. So without having that, there isn't a report that they can make. However, I do think that it's possible to be able to have observed something potentially during a Zoom interaction with a child that could lead to a reasonable suspicion. So there's, there's been an extreme case of this, which I certainly hope we don't see happen anymore. But when Zach and I were talking about what this episode could cover, I just happened to come across a news story from Florida where there was a young girl, school age girl, that was in her home, and presumably in the kitchen, doing a Zoom class with her whole classroom. And her mother's ex-boyfriend came into the house and shot and killed her mother during the Zoom class. And the newspaper article did state that the teacher did hear some arguing happening prior to this. So that does lead me to believe that it might be possible that teachers could observe or have some information that could lead to that reasonable suspicion through having the Zoom interaction, and that might be a basis enough to make a report.
Yeah, and I think just because typical mandated reporters aren't in front of children as often as they might be, it is important to remember that anyone can make a report too. So all the information's out there on how to do so. And if you have questions, I know that if you just call the DCFS hotline, they're more than willing to answer any questions that you have, from my experience.
Yes, they will let you know whether what you are reporting is reportable. DCFS doesn't take every single solitary report. You have to be what they call an eligible perpetrator. There's an eligible perpetrator that has to be part of what you're reporting, and that typically is a person that has some level of authority or a child care basis over the child at the time. So that makes it so. One of the things that DCFS doesn't take, that some people are sometimes confused about, is they don't take reports of children hurting other children. That doesn't fall into their realm, unless of course you've got a teenager who's in like maybe a babysitting position over a younger child. But generally speaking, they won't take a report of a neighbor who has hurt a child if that neighbor wasn't in a caretaking position of the child at that time. But Zach is correct. Anybody can make a report to DCFS. It does not have to be a mandated reporter. We will make sure that the number to report to DCFS ends up in our chat stream. I think I know what it is off the top of my head, but I'm afraid if I say it and I get it wrong, people will call the wrong number. So I'm not going to say it.
Okay, Celeste, I hear we have some more questions coming in.
Yes, we do. They're actually directed to you, Zach.
Oh,
Hey.
Jenny says yay. So they're about community education. So Zach, as a community education department, how are you taking steps to educate on healthy relationships?
so we have transitioned our curriculum a little bit to really hone in on this. So if anyone's interested for the upcoming school year, now that we're starting, we offer the virtual option. So even if you're not in school, we could still teach on this subject, but we added a lot of content regarding consent. What is it? Really simplifying the subject, because we noticed that for high school, it was not a topic that was spoken about. So we are definitely talking about that. We're talking about what's healthy and unhealthy. We're talking about what's in the middle, things like jealousy, things like excessive phone calls and texts, things along those lines. So although we do have, we give the information straight up as well, we do have a discussion component within our curriculum. So it's definitely part of all levels of our prevention program. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that as well.
I have another question for you, Zach. So is a community education maintaining relationships with local teachers during this time?
Yeah, so we're continuing to maintain our existing relationships with the school districts, because a lot of them we've known for years and years. So we are communicating with them, kind of getting information as quickly as we can on how to set up presentations for the upcoming school year. So definitely, if we haven't spoken with you in the past, feel free to contact us. But we definitely are, because we know every school district is handling things a little bit differently. So those personal relationships are very important to us.
I think those are great questions to be posing to Zach, because one of the things that I'm concerned about with what's happening right now is that some of the focus is moving away from those social emotional needs that children have, or maybe they're focusing a little bit more on the younger kids and not so much on that middle school and high school kids. And I think that it's vital for us to be pointing out that those social emotional needs still exist right now. So all of the kinds of information we thought was important for children to have last school year is still important for them to have this year. And in some cases, it's even more important for them to have it now than it was before this pandemic came.
Yeah, and just as you're saying, when it's stressed at a young age, and then it falls out of focus for a lot of the middle school and high school ages, um, it just becomes that much more important because it's a lesson that's forgotten. So we definitely stress it at all levels for our prevention program.
Yeah, well, that's one of the great things about our prevention program is the repetition. So you guys can have kids that have listened to you in first and second grade, and then they see you again in fifth grade, and then they see you again maybe in seventh and eighth grade. So like every couple of years, the message is reinforced and you build on it a little bit more because they're older and there are different things happening in their lives. And that we know that repetition is so important for a type of learning to take hold.
Yeah, absolutely. The message is the same. It's just different depending on your age group and the level of detail. So anything else from Celeste?
So we have another question here. We've kind of already touched on the topic. So if you would like to add, it says, what would you like for everyone to know that we as a community can do to be watchful over our kids in the community?
So I think that something is really important for us to do is to think about the mental health of children and to think about the social emotional needs of children. So a lot of the talking that I've heard around the ways in which we return back to school is this focus on, or this concern about, our kids going to lose their educational learning? Are they going to fall behind educationally? So I think a piece that I would really love for everyone to make sure that we're remembering and that we're focusing on is that if our children are not in a healthy mental state, if they are not, regulated, we say, right? If they're not calm or feeling confident and okay, they're not going to be able to learn. And so the first and foremost thing that we need to do as a community is make sure that our children are at that baseline. So Zach and I have been talking about, we've actually did quite a bit of research each of us coming into this episode, because we really wanted to make sure kind of like what's going on with kids and what do we need to be worried about with them. And part of that research and the things that we've been talking about is talking about brain development, right? And what needs to happen in the brain in order for kids to be able to learn. And learning is at the top of the brain. And being calm and being able to, they call it regulation, but I'm just going to say it's like being calm and centered, maybe is a more accessible word, is at the bottom of the brain. And you have to be able to have that bottom of the brain piece taken care of in order to reach the top of the brain. So it is just as important for us as a community, and probably the primary thing we need to do as a community is to get kids to that regulated, calm place so that they even have a chance for absorbing the learning. And Zach, I don't know if you want to jump in, because I know you watched the same things and read a lot too about this.
Yeah, just to add on a little bit, I think if someone is struggling academically, that might be the number one place to focus on before um, even getting real concerned with the schoolwork. If someone's not in a place that they're ready to learn or able to learn, then that should definitely be addressed. So definitely keep tabs on that, as well as the schoolwork, which is very important as well.
Yeah, and I think when I'm hearing you now that you're saying that, it makes me think of, as a community, we're talking about a lot about how to support the kid, how to support the kid, how to support the kid. Well, we also know, I think, from working at South Suburban Family Shelter and providing counseling to adults who've experienced domestic violence, we know one of the best ways to help take care of the kid is to take care of that adult that is charged with caring with that kid. So all of the things that we're talking about here are best accomplished with children when adults also are their best selves. So as a community, I don't know if it sounds hokey, but we really do need to support each other. We really do need to make sure that adults are in a place where they can best support the kids that are in their lives for whatever reason. So it is, giving people grace. It is making sure we know all of the resources that are around that people can be taking advantage of. It is trying to do that piece where we're withholding judgment and evaluation on people's choices and trying to give people the benefit of the doubt that they are doing the best that they can with what they are given right now. And which for a lot of people, we've been given something we never thought that we would ever have to deal with.
And I'll just one last thing. At the expense of sounding simplistic, it is important to be outside while you can, have the healthy routine. So I'm just going to reiterate a few of those things. Have a consistent workspace, a consistent sleep schedule. All those things will definitely help the mental health of someone going through this right now. All right. So Celeste, anything else?
No, nothing else.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Celeste. We'll go ahead and close this interview out. So we did cover a lot. I just want to mention that one more time that our prevention program is up and running. We're ready to go for the school year. So go ahead and contact us. You could find the information on our website, ssfs1.org. And we are putting our materials on the website. We are currently working on that. So that'll be something to look forward to. And Jennifer, was there anything else that we covered? So many topics, a whole range.
And there certainly is so much to say about it. But I will end on the same note that you ended on, in as much as we can do things that bring us some amount of pleasure and peace. I would encourage folks to do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on again.
Of course.
And everyone, thank you for watching. Go ahead and like our video, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and we'll see you next Tuesday.